People think hunger is the worst thing that can happen to an Omega, but they've never learned what it feels like to be invisible. Elliot Mercer had stopped counting the days since anyone had called him by name instead of kid, stray, or simply waving him away with a look that said he didn't belong. At 19, he had learned that surviving in Harbor East was less about strength and more about knowing which streets belonged to which syndicates, which alleys stayed warm after midnight, and which dumpsters behind expensive restaurants might still hold untouched bread before the garbage trucks arrived. As an undocumented Omega, he officially did not exist inside the National ABO registry. Without a registered scent profile or verified bloodline, he could not apply for legal work, receive public housing, or even enter most emergency shelters that required identity verification. The law claimed the registry protected society by preventing fraud and safeguarding alpha, beta, and omega rights. In reality, people like Elliot simply disappeared between the lines. Every morning before sunrise, the Blackridge Syndicate distributed leftover meals from one of its waterfront kitchens to workers, couriers, and neighborhood families. The unspoken rule was simple. Residents came first. Employees second. Outsiders never. Elliot still waited near the end of the line anyway because hope, no matter how irrational, was lighter to carry than despair. The cold Atlantic wind swept through the docks, carrying the smell of saltwater, diesel fuel, and fresh bread drifting from the massive industrial kitchen. His stomach tightened painfully. He had eaten only half an apple during the previous day, stretching every bite as though chewing slowly could fool his body into believing it was enough. Around him, several Alpha security guards stood in tailored black coats bearing the silver crest of Blackridge, their calm discipline making the entire dockyard feel less like a food line and more like the entrance to a fortress. Elliot kept his head down. Omegas without registration often attracted unnecessary attention, and unnecessary attention usually ended badly. When the final tray was nearly empty, he stepped forward with quiet hesitation. "Excuse me," he asked softly, holding an old paper container that had clearly been folded and reused many times. "If there are any leftovers no one wants, I'd be grateful." One guard looked ready to dismiss him immediately, but another hesitated. Before either could answer, an unusual silence spread through the loading yard. Conversation stopped. Delivery trucks paused. Even the gulls circling overhead seemed strangely distant. A sleek black SUV rolled slowly through the warehouse gates, followed by two identical vehicles. Every Alpha in sight straightened instinctively. Elliot recognized the crest on the doors long before he recognized the man who stepped out. Damian Blackridge rarely appeared in public despite controlling one of the largest syndicates on the East Coast. Rumors described him as cold, calculating, impossible to deceive, and respected by rivals because he preferred order over fear. Elliot had never imagined someone like that would notice someone like him. Damian adjusted one cuff of his charcoal coat before scanning the dock with quiet precision. He acknowledged workers with subtle nods, listening to brief reports while walking toward the kitchen entrance. Then his gaze shifted. It landed directly on Elliot. For one impossible second, the world became unnaturally still. Damian's expression barely changed, yet something ancient stirred beneath the disciplined control every Alpha leader was trained to master. His instincts did not react with territorial dominance, suspicion, or attraction. Instead, an overwhelming wave of protective certainty crashed through him so suddenly that it almost stole his breath. The unfamiliar sensation unsettled him. Alpha instincts were powerful, but they always followed predictable patterns shaped by biology, law, and experience. This did not fit any pattern he had ever known. Elliot lowered his eyes immediately, assuming he had violated some invisible rule simply by standing there. He took one cautious step backward. Damian continued watching him, studying the silver hair tousled by the wind, the worn jacket hanging loosely from narrow shoulders, and the quiet dignity that somehow survived beneath exhaustion. Deep within the faint traces of the young Omega's natural scent, nearly hidden beneath cheap neutralizing soap and the harsh smell of cold air, Damian sensed a microscopic signature that felt impossibly familiar. It vanished almost instantly, leaving only questions. The nearest guard cleared his throat uncertainly. "Sir, should we move him along?" Damien answered without taking his eyes off the young Omega. "No," his voice remained calm, but every Alpha nearby obeyed before the sentence had fully ended. "Bring him inside. Feed him first. Then notify my office that I'm postponing the next meeting." Confusion spread across the dockyard. Damien Blackridge had cancelled negotiations with rival syndicates only once in 20 years, and never because of a homeless stranger asking for leftovers. Elliot looked up in disbelief, convinced they had mistaken him for someone else. He opened his mouth to explain that he did not want trouble, only a meal, but the words refused to come. For reasons neither of them could possibly understand, the most powerful Alpha on the waterfront had just changed the course of both their lives with a single quiet command. Elliot expected a guarded office, a harsh interrogation, or perhaps a quiet warning never to return. Instead, he found himself sitting alone inside a warm dining room overlooking the harbor while a kitchen attendant placed a steaming bowl of seafood chowder, fresh bread, and a glass of water in front of him without asking for identification. The simple kindness unsettled him more than suspicion ever could. He waited several minutes before touching the spoon, convinced someone would eventually tell him the meal had been intended for somebody else. No one did. Across the building, Damien Blackridge stood inside a private conference room where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the loading docks. The scheduled meeting with several district captains remained delayed, an unprecedented decision that had already become the subject of whispered conversations throughout the syndicate headquarters. Damien rarely changed plans once they had been announced. Yet his attention kept returning to the young Omega downstairs. He replayed the brief encounter repeatedly, searching for a rational explanation. Alpha instincts were shaped by biology and reinforced through years of discipline. They warned of threats, recognized hierarchy, and occasionally responded to established family bonds documented inside the National ABO Registry. What Damien had experienced belonged to none of those categories. It had felt immediate, undeniable, and profoundly personal. His chief advisor, Cassian Graves, entered without knocking after receiving permission. Tall, composed, and impeccably dressed, Cassian noticed the untouched documents covering Damien's desk before speaking carefully. "The waterfront captains are waiting. They are concerned about the delay." Damien answered without looking away from the harbor. "Run a quiet background check on the Omega brought inside." Cassian raised one eyebrow. "An undocumented Omega? Everything that can be found." Cassian hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "There will not be much. Individuals outside the registry leave almost no legal trail." Damien finally turned toward him. "That is exactly why I want answers." Meanwhile, Elliot slowly finished the meal, each bite easing an ache he had almost forgotten could disappear. A staff member offered him clean clothes, but he politely declined, explaining that borrowed things always had to be returned eventually. The employee smiled gently and replied that the clothing had been purchased for emergency outreach sponsored by the Blackridge Foundation, a charitable program that quietly provided assistance to vulnerable Omegas and Betas who had fallen outside the formal support system. Elliot accepted only after hearing those words. Charity carried no hidden debt. At least that was what he wanted to believe. Before leaving, he was escorted through the administrative wing where polished marble floors reflected the afternoon sunlight. Employees greeted one another with practiced professionalism while Alpha security officers monitored every entrance. Elliot kept his eyes lowered until a strange sensation washed over the corridor. Several nearby Alphas paused almost simultaneously, each turning briefly toward him with expressions of quiet confusion before continuing their work. None appeared hostile. Instead, they seemed uncertain, as though they had sensed something they could not explain. Damien observed the moment from an upper balcony. It happened again. That impossible familiarity surfaced beneath the faint traces of Elliot's restrained scent, subtle enough that only a highly trained Alpha might notice. It was not attraction. It resembled the instinctive recognition described only in rare medical journals discussing hereditary pheromone markers passed through direct bloodlines. Those markers were considered nearly impossible to detect consciously and even less likely to trigger a response without laboratory confirmation. Damien had dismissed such theories as academic speculation years ago. Now he was no longer certain. Later that afternoon, inside the secure archives maintained by Blackridge Intelligence, Cashin reviewed the preliminary report delivered by his analysts. There was almost nothing. No birth certificate. No educational records. No employment history. No registry identification. One line alone stood out. Approximately 19 years earlier, an unnamed Omega infant had briefly appeared in an emergency municipal intake log before every associated record vanished from the national database within 48 hours. Cashin stared at the screen longer than necessary. Unauthorized deletion of ABO registry data required authorization from only a handful of government officials. Whoever had erased that child had possessed extraordinary influence. Quietly, without informing Damien, Cashin forwarded the record to a private encrypted address belonging to a retired registry administrator named Dr. Victor Harlow. Within minutes, a single reply arrived. If the boy is alive, do not let Damien discover the truth until we speak. Cashin slowly closed the message, realizing that the homeless Omega who had walked in asking for leftovers might unknowingly carry a secret capable of reshaping far more than one family's past. The following morning, Elliot returned to the abandoned warehouse where he had been sleeping for nearly 3 months, carrying the folded clothes the Blackridge Foundation had given him and enough bread to last another day. He sat quietly beside a cracked window overlooking the harbor, wondering why the most powerful alpha in the city had treated him with unexpected respect instead of suspicion. Experience had taught him that unusual kindness often carried a hidden price, yet nothing had been demanded in return. For the first time in years, uncertainty felt heavier than hunger. Across the city, Damien arrived at Blackridge Tower before sunrise. His thoughts remained fixed on the unexplained reaction he had experienced near Elliot. He instructed his personal assistant to contact Nora Ellington, one of the few attorneys who specialized in ABO's civil identity law and unauthorized registry disputes. Nora had built her reputation representing individuals whose legal identities had been damaged by administrative corruption, and although she rarely accepted private clients, she respected Damien because his charitable foundation had quietly funded several successful legal aid programs. Less than an hour later, Nora entered his office carrying a secure tablet and several archived legal manuals. After listening carefully to Damien describe the unusual circumstances without exaggeration, she became unusually serious. If what you sensed resembles an inherited pheromone marker, she said, then the first place we must investigate is not your family. It is the registry itself. Blood records cannot disappear naturally. Damien folded his hands. Can someone erase an Omega from the National ABO Registry completely? Nora nodded slowly. Not legally. Every alpha, beta, and omega receives a biological identity shortly after birth. Even if someone changes a name, the genetic registration remains permanent. To remove every trace would require authorization from one of the highest administrative levels decades ago. Within hours, Nora obtained temporary legal access to an underground archival facility that stored inactive registry backups no longer connected to the national network. Located beneath an aging Federal Records building, the archive felt untouched by time. Endless. Rows of reinforced cabinets stretched beneath soft white lights while climate-controlled servers quietly preserved millions of forgotten files. A senior records technician escorted Nora through multiple security checkpoints before stopping in front of an isolated terminal reserved for historical recovery requests. She entered the limited information they possessed. Approximate birth year. Unknown Omega infant. Emergency municipal intake. Harbor District. The system searched silently for nearly a minute before displaying a fragmented result. One incomplete registration appeared for less than a second before an access restriction interrupted the search. Nora immediately requested a manual recovery. The technician frowned as he reviewed the database. "This is unusual," he admitted. "The original registration existed. Someone erased nearly every associated record afterward. Can you recover the authorization history?" Nora asked. After another search, one damaged administrative signature surfaced. Most identifying information had been intentionally overwritten years earlier, but one detail remained readable. The deletion request had been approved through the Office of National Genetic Administration by an official identified only as Dr. V. Harlow. Nora quietly photographed the screen before the corrupted file disappeared again. At nearly the same moment, several miles away, Dr. Victor Harlow received an automated security notification informing him that restricted archival data connected to a protected historical case had been accessed. The retired administrator remained perfectly calm as he closed the alert and reached for a locked storage box inside his private study. Beneath old government commendations rested a faded infant hospital bracelet, a worn photograph, and a sealed envelope marked with a handwritten warning. "Never allow Blackridge to find the child." Victor stared at the envelope for several silent moments before placing everything back inside the box. Meanwhile, Cashin arrived at Victor's residence through a private entrance after sunset. The older Beta welcomed him without surprise. "Damien has started asking questions," Cashin reported. Quietly. Victor sighed. "I expected this day eventually." "Who is the Omega?" Cashin asked. Victor did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the dark window. He was never supposed to survive long enough for anyone to ask that question. Back at Blackridge Tower, Nora returned with the recovered evidence and placed the copied authorization record on Damien's desk. He studied the surviving signature in complete silence. The mystery had changed. This was no longer about an undocumented homeless Omega. Someone with extraordinary authority had deliberately erased a child's entire legal existence nearly 2 decades earlier, and every answer pointed toward a conspiracy hidden deep within the very system that governed Alpha, Beta, and Omega society. Damien spent the next 2 days following routines that had guided him through decades of leadership, yet every report, every meeting, and every negotiation seemed strangely distant compared to the unanswered questions surrounding Elliot. The copied authorization record remained on his desk beside a faded photograph he rarely allowed anyone to see. It showed a younger version of himself standing beside an Omega whose gentle smile had once made even the busiest days feel lighter. 20 years had passed since that photograph had been taken, shortly before the Omega disappeared during a period of political turmoil that had shaken several major syndicates. No body had ever been found. No official explanation had ever satisfied Damien. He had accepted the loss because every investigation had reached the same conclusion. There had been nothing left to find. Now, for the first time in years, doubt quietly returned. Nora suggested another direction. If government records were erased, then we should look outside the government. Shelters, churches, volunteer clinics, and orphan programs often kept handwritten logs before everything became digital. Damien immediately approved the search. By late afternoon, Nora arrived at a modest brick building operated by Father Rowan Hale, an elderly Omega who had spent most of his life caring for abandoned Alpha, Beta, and Omega children overlooked by the system. The shelter smelled of fresh soup, laundry soap, and old books. Children laughed in the courtyard while volunteers prepared evening meals. Father Rowan welcomed Nora warmly before listening to her questions with growing concern. When she mentioned an undocumented Omega believed to be around 19 years old, his thoughtful expression slowly changed. "There was one child," he said quietly. "He arrived during a terrible winter almost 2 decades ago. A municipal worker carried him here wrapped in a faded blanket because every official placement center refused to accept him after receiving unexpected government instructions." Father Rowan disappeared into a storage room before returning with a weathered wooden box containing handwritten intake journals preserved long after electronic systems replaced paper files. Turning delicate pages with practiced care, he stopped at an entry dated 19 years earlier. The child's name field remained blank. Beside it someone had written only 3 words. Silver blanket. Healthy omega. No family listed. Tucked between the pages rested a tiny piece of embroidered fabric that had apparently fallen from the original blanket years before. Nora carefully unfolded it. Sewn into the corner with silver thread was a crest shaped like a black hawk surrounded by a circular laurel. She recognized it immediately. It was an older version of the Blackridge family emblem used before the syndicate modernized its official insignia nearly 20 years earlier. Father Rowan lowered his voice. The municipal worker who brought the child whispered something before leaving. He said powerful people wanted everyone to forget the baby had ever existed. He looked frightened, and I never saw him again. That evening Nora placed the embroidered cloth on Damien's desk. The room fell completely silent. Damien reached toward the fabric with steady hands, but the moment his fingers touched the faded stitching, memories surfaced with startling clarity. Years ago, he had commissioned that exact design for a handmade nursery blanket intended for the child he and his Omega partner had been expecting before tragedy separated them. Only one blanket had ever been created. Damien closed his eyes briefly as emotions he had buried beneath discipline and responsibility threatened to break through. Across town, Elliot unknowingly volunteered at Father Rowan's shelter, helping younger children organize donated books after receiving a quiet invitation to return whenever he wished. Watching Elliot laugh gently with children who trusted him without hesitation, Father Rowan studied the young Omega with thoughtful eyes. There was something familiar about the kindness in his smile, something he had noticed years earlier in another visitor who had searched endlessly for a missing family before disappearing from the shelter forever. At the same time, Cashin met once again with Victor Harlow. When Victor learned that the old blanket had been found, the color drained from his face. "Then we have even less time than I feared," he murmured. Cashin leaned forward. "What exactly are we trying to stop?" Victor answered with quiet certainty. "Not a reunion. A truth that could change the balance of power across every registered alpha bloodline in the country." Damien made his decision before sunrise. If the registry could no longer be trusted, then only the formal biological verification recognized under federal ABO heritage law could answer the question that had begun to reshape every certainty he possessed. Unlike ordinary genetic testing, hereditary confirmation involving a registered alpha bloodline required a supervised examination combining genetic markers with documented pheromone resonance, a procedure overseen by certified legal specialists to prevent fraudulent inheritance claims. Nora arranged the appointment through an independent laboratory whose findings were accepted by both the courts and the National ABO Registry. Elliot almost refused. Sitting across from Damien inside a quiet conference room, he folded his hands together and spoke with obvious discomfort. "I appreciate everything you have done for me, but I do not want to become part of something that creates problems for your organization. I am just someone who happened to ask for a meal." Damien answered calmly. "If there is no connection, the test will end the questions. If there is, then both of us deserve the truth." Elliot studied his face before slowly nodding. For the first time in many years, someone had asked for his agreement instead of making a decision on his behalf. That alone convinced him to accept. The laboratory occupied the upper floors of a medical research center overlooking the river. Every participant entering the hereditary verification suite surrendered identification, underwent scent neutralization, and signed legal consent forms witnessed by Nora. The examination itself remained surprisingly simple. Small genetic samples were collected before both participants entered adjacent observation chambers separated by reinforced transparent panels designed specifically for controlled pheromone analysis. A senior examiner explained that inherited pheromone signatures rarely produced measurable reactions unless direct blood relatives were involved. Most sessions concluded within minutes without unusual findings. The equipment activated quietly. At first, nothing happened. Elliot stood comfortably inside his chamber while Damien waited across from him. Then soft blue indicators along the monitoring wall brightened one by one. The examiner frowned before checking the calibration twice. The resonance index continued climbing beyond the normal range. Additional sensors activated automatically, recording biological responses neither participant consciously controlled. One technician whispered something to another before leaving to consult archived reference data. Nora watched silently as the examiner finally turned toward her. "This degree of hereditary resonance is exceptionally uncommon," he admitted. "We cannot issue legal conclusions until genetic sequencing finishes, but the preliminary biological response strongly suggests an immediate direct blood relationship." Damien remained perfectly still, yet his eyes never left Elliot. Elliot looked equally confused, glancing between the glowing instruments and the specialists gathering around their monitors. Before anyone could say more, a warning tone interrupted the session. The central database connection had suddenly failed. Every digital display froze before switching to emergency backup mode. Laboratory staff quickly began restoring the system while apologizing for the unexpected interruption. Nora immediately sensed something was wrong. The laboratory maintained multiple protected networks specifically to prevent accidental outages. Complete interruption was almost impossible. While technicians struggled to recover the encrypted files, Cashin sat alone inside his office several miles away. An anonymous data package had just appeared on his private terminal. Attached was a single message from Victor Harlow. "The preliminary results must never become public." Cashin stared at the words before opening the encrypted attachment. Inside was a sophisticated intrusion program designed to intercept laboratory transmissions before final certification reached the National ABO registry. He hesitated only briefly before activating it. Minutes later, the laboratory restored partial operations, but the lead examiner's expression changed as he reviewed the recovered records. "Someone accessed the verification archive remotely during the interruption," he announced. "The preliminary data remains intact, but portions of the certification pathway have been copied." Nora's face hardened immediately. This was no ordinary computer failure. Someone already knew the examination mattered. As Damien and Elliot left the research center beneath a gray afternoon sky, neither realized unseen forces had already begun moving against them. Hidden behind encrypted networks and forgotten government decisions made nearly 20 years earlier, the truth was no longer buried. It had simply become valuable enough that powerful people were determined to keep it from ever reaching the public record. Cashin wasted no time turning uncertainty into suspicion. Before the laboratory could complete its official certification, carefully selected fragments of the intercepted report quietly circulated among influential Alpha Council members. By the following morning, rumors had already spread through Black Ridge headquarters. Some claimed Damien intended to install an undocumented Omega as his personal heir. Others insisted the laboratory had been manipulated to fabricate a bloodline that never existed. Within the structured hierarchy of ABO society, legitimacy depended not only upon biology but also upon lawful registration. An Omega erased from the National ABO Registry occupied a dangerous legal gray area, and ambitious leaders understood exactly how to exploit that uncertainty. Damien was summoned to an emergency session of the Regional Alpha Council, an oversight body responsible for monitoring the succession of every major registered syndicate. The hearing took place inside a historic marble chamber where generations of Alpha leaders had debated matters of law, territory, and hereditary responsibility. Elliot remained outside under Nora's guidance, unaware that his existence had suddenly become the center of a political crisis. Damien entered alone and faced a semicircle of senior council members. The chairwoman opened the proceedings with measured professionalism. Until the hereditary verification receives full legal certification, any action suggesting recognition of an undocumented claimant may threaten the stability of registered succession. Under federal ABO heritage law, we are placing all succession-related decisions involving Black Ridge under temporary review. Damien remained composed. The investigation seeks facts, not power. An older Alpha responded calmly. Facts require lawful documentation, and at present the documentation does not exist. Damien understood the implication immediately. Without official registry recognition, Elliot could be dismissed as a legal impossibility regardless of biological evidence. Outside the council building, Nora finally explained the situation to Elliot. He listened quietly before lowering his eyes. "Everything was peaceful before I appeared," he said softly. "Now your foundation, your organization, and your reputation are all under attack because of me." Nora answered without hesitation. "The problem is not you. The problem is that someone erased your identity long before you were old enough to speak." Elliot appreciated her honesty, yet guilt settled heavily inside him. Throughout his life he had survived by staying unnoticed. Now every step he took seemed to create conflict. For people who had shown him kindness. That evening, Father Rowan welcomed Elliot back to the shelter after noticing the worry on his face. Children ran through the courtyard carrying donated books while volunteers prepared dinner together. Watching the simple routine reminded Elliot of something he had never truly possessed, a place where people expected him to return. Father Rowan placed a warm cup of tea beside him. "Sometimes," the elderly Omega said gently, "walking away feels like protecting everyone else. But disappearing does not erase the truth." Elliot smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But it might stop innocent people from paying for my past." Across town, Victor Harlow met Cashin inside a quiet private office. Victor appeared far more anxious than before. "The council acted faster than I expected," he admitted. Cashin folded his hands. "Temporary review buys us time, but Damien will continue searching." Victor nodded slowly. "Then the remaining evidence must never reach him." Cashin looked directly at the retired administrator. "You still have something besides the registry files?" Victor hesitated before answering. "There is one final record. If anyone sees it, every decision made 19 years ago will collapse." Meanwhile, Damien returned to Blackridge Tower long after sunset. He expected to find Elliot waiting as Nora had arranged. Instead, Elliot's borrowed room stood perfectly organized. The clean clothes from the foundation had been folded neatly on the bed. Beside them rested a handwritten note. "Thank you for treating me with dignity when the world forgot I existed. I cannot allow my unanswered past to destroy everything you have built. Please stop looking for me." Damien read the message twice before quietly folding it into his pocket. From the window overlooking the harbor, he noticed a lone figure walking away beneath steady rain, carrying the same worn backpack Elliot had arrived with days earlier. For the second time in his life, someone connected to his unanswered past had vanished before he could learn the truth, but this time he refused to accept goodbye as the end of the story. Damien ordered every available investigator to search. Quietly, but not a single team was allowed to treat Elliot as a fugitive. Their instructions were simple. Find him, protect him if necessary, and above all make certain no one pressured him into returning. The order confused many within Blackridge because it placed the well-being of an undocumented Omega above the syndicate's immediate political interests. While search teams spread across Harbor East, Nora refused to believe Elliot had disappeared without leaving a clue. She returned to Father Rowan's shelter, carefully reviewing every visitor log, donation record, and handwritten note from the past several weeks. Hidden inside one of the books Elliot had been repairing for the children, she found a folded library receipt. Written on the back in Elliot's neat handwriting was the address of an abandoned community archive where he occasionally volunteered to organize damaged historical documents in exchange for warm meals during the winter. Nora immediately contacted Damien, and within an hour they arrived at the neglected building together. Elliot was exactly where the note suggested, quietly restoring old records that most people considered worthless. He looked genuinely surprised to see them but did not run. Before anyone could speak, Nora placed a weathered file box on the table. "I found something while reviewing inactive municipal donations," she said. "It was never entered into any government archive." Inside the box rested several sealed envelopes, an old hospital ledger, and a magnetic data cartridge preserved inside protective packaging. Each item had been donated anonymously years earlier with instructions that they remain unopened unless someone legally challenged the disappearance of an unidentified Omega child. Nora carefully inserted the cartridge into a secure reader she had brought from her office. A grainy recording appeared on the screen. A younger Dr. Victor Harlow sat inside what looked like a government office, speaking directly into a confidential archival camera. His voice sounded tired rather than proud. This statement is being recorded under sealed administrative privilege. Today I approve the unauthorized removal of one Omega child's identity from the National ABO Registry. The order did not originate from me. It came from officials who believed the child represented a threat to political stability because of his hereditary connection to the Blackridge bloodline. I was told the child would be quietly relocated and protected. I later learned those promises were false. Elliot stared at the screen in complete silence while Damien remained motionless beside him. The recording continued. The Omega parent entrusted the infant to emergency officials after discovering an organized effort to eliminate every legal trace connecting the child to Blackridge succession. The parent believed disappearing was the only way to ensure the infant survived. If this recording is ever viewed, then the child has lived long enough to deserve the truth that government records denied him. The video ended abruptly. No one spoke for several long moments. Elliot finally looked toward Damien with uncertainty rather than expectation. "I never wanted any of this," he whispered. Damien answered just as quietly. "Neither did the people who tried to protect you." Nora then opened the hospital ledger. Unlike the destroyed registry files, this handwritten record had escaped digital manipulation because it had been archived before electronic conversion. One entry immediately captured her attention. It documented the birth of an Omega child delivered 19 years earlier. Beneath the section labeled Registered Alpha Parent, the attending physician had written one unmistakable name. Damien Blackridge. The room fell completely silent again. Elliot instinctively stepped backward, overwhelmed by the discovery, while Damien closed his eyes as memories returned with painful clarity. He remembered preparing the nursery, choosing the handmade blanket embroidered with the family crest, and believing he would soon become a father before chaos had stolen everything away. The final envelope inside the box contained a letter written by the missing Omega parent shortly before disappearing. Its first sentence changed everything. "If Damien ever finds our son, tell him I never stopped believing he would choose our child over power." At that moment, Damien understood the terrible truth. Elliot had never been abandoned by his parents. He had been separated from them by people who believed that controlling an alpha bloodline was more valuable than preserving a family, and the conspiracy that began 19 years earlier had finally started to unravel. News of the recovered evidence spread through the Regional Alpha Council before sunrise, forcing an extraordinary emergency session attended by syndicate leaders, legal observers, and representatives from the National ABO Registry. The chamber felt heavier than before, not because of raised voices but because everyone understood that the outcome would establish a precedent capable of affecting registered alpha bloodlines across the country. Damien entered beside Nora and Elliot, who wore a simple dark suit provided by the Blackridge Foundation. He looked uncomfortable under the attention of so many influential figures, yet he walked with quiet dignity that surprised even those who had questioned his existence only days earlier. Cashin remained seated among the senior Blackridge representatives, his expression perfectly controlled, while Victor Harlow sat several rows behind him with eyes fixed on the floor. The chairwoman opened the hearing by acknowledging the newly discovered documents before inviting Damien to present his position. Instead of demanding immediate recognition of Elliot as his heir, Damien stood calmly and addressed the council with unexpected restraint. "Today is not about inheritance," he said. "It is about correcting a crime committed against a child whose legal identity was deliberately erased. Federal ABO heritage law exists to protect verified bloodlines, not to erase them when they become politically inconvenient." His words settled across the chamber in complete silence. Nora then presented the hospital ledger, the preserved administrative recording, the handwritten letter, and the recovered authorization history linking the unlawful registry deletion to Dr. Victor Harlow. Every document had already undergone independent authentication overnight. The evidence established a consistent timeline showing that Elliot's legal identity had disappeared only after his birth had already been officially recorded. The chairwoman turned toward Victor. "Dr. Harlow, do you dispute the authenticity of these records? Victor slowly stood. Years of carefully protected secrecy seemed to disappear from his face. No, he answered quietly. They are genuine. A wave of restrained whispers spread through the chamber. Victor continued before anyone questioned him further. I believed I was preventing conflict between powerful syndicates. Instead, I helped destroy a family. I accepted assurances that the child would receive a new legal identity and live safely outside political influence. That promise was broken almost immediately. Cashin finally rose from his seat. Even if the documents are authentic, the registry no longer recognizes this Omega. Without continuous legal registration, hereditary succession remains uncertain. Nora responded immediately. Federal law specifically allows restoration when government misconduct caused unlawful deletion. Biological truth does not disappear because corrupted records say otherwise. The chairwoman requested the laboratory examiner to present the completed hereditary verification that had finally been reconstructed after recovering the interrupted certification files. The examiner activated a large display visible throughout the chamber. Genetic sequencing, hereditary pheromone resonance, and independent biological analysis all reached the same conclusion. Elliot Mercer was confirmed as the direct biological son of Damian Blackridge with overwhelming scientific certainty. Several council members quietly exchanged astonished glances. Cashin realized the political argument he had relied upon had collapsed. Damian then surprised everyone once again. Instead of asking the council to recognize Elliot as successor to Blackridge, he made a completely different request. I ask this council to restore Elliot's legal identity because every Omega, Alpha, and Beta deserves protection under the law regardless of how powerful the people were who tried to erase them. Whether my son ever chooses to stand beside me is his decision alone. Elliot looked toward Damian with visible emotion, hearing the word son spoken publicly for the very first time. Across the chamber, Victor slowly removed a small security key from his pocket and handed it to Nora. This unlocks every remaining archive connected to the deletion program, he said. There were other children whose identities were manipulated. They deserve justice as well. The chairwoman accepted the recommendation for immediate restoration by unanimous vote. The council formally ordered Elliot's legal identity reinstated and directed federal investigators to reopen every registry case associated with the concealed program. As the hearing concluded, Cashin quietly left through a side entrance without speaking to anyone, while Damian remained beside Elliot, not as the head of a syndicate addressing a political victory, but as a father who had finally chosen family over power in front of the entire Alpha leadership of the nation. 3 months after the Regional Alpha Council restored Elliot's legal identity, Harbor East looked different in ways that statistics alone could never explain. New registration offices had opened beside community shelters, offering free legal assistance to undocumented alphas, betas, and omegas whose records had been lost, altered, or unlawfully erased. Federal investigators continued reopening forgotten cases connected to the registry manipulation program, while volunteers from the Blackridge Foundation worked alongside independent attorneys to help families recover identities they believed had been gone forever. Newspapers called the reforms historic. Elliot simply called them overdue. Despite repeated requests from syndicate advisors, he politely declined every proposal that would have placed him in the formal line of Blackridge succession. During one private meeting, Damian slid a folder across the table containing official documents recognizing Elliot as his lawful heir under federal ABO heritage law. Elliot read every page carefully before closing the folder with a gentle smile. I spent 19 years wishing someone would recognize that I existed, he said. Now that I finally have my name back, I want to decide what kind of life that name represents. I do not want people to remember me because I inherited power. I want them to remember that no child should disappear because of a government record. Damian studied his son for a long moment before quietly taking the folder back without disappointment. For perhaps the first time in his life, he understood that protecting family did not mean deciding their future. It meant giving them the freedom to choose it themselves. Together with Nora and Father Rowan, Elliot proposed creating the Harbor Identity Initiative, a permanent non-profit organization dedicated to helping undocumented alphas, betas, and omegas obtain legal recognition, education, employment assistance, and housing without discrimination. The Regional Alpha Council unanimously approved the initiative after acknowledging that the registry system existed to protect citizens rather than exclude them. Damien committed financial support through the Blackridge Foundation but insisted the organization remain independent from syndicate influence so every family could trust its mission regardless of social status. Even Victor Harlow accepted responsibility by voluntarily assisting investigators in identifying hidden archival records, spending his remaining years helping restore identities that his decisions had once erased. His public apology could never undo the past, but it allowed many families to finally receive answers they had sought for decades. One cool autumn afternoon, Elliot returned to the same waterfront kitchen where everything had begun. The long food line remained, but now every person received a warm meal without being asked for registry documents before reaching the serving table. Volunteers laughed together while children carried fresh bread to elderly neighbors waiting nearby. Father Rowan supervised the younger helpers with quiet pride, and Nora organized legal information booths beside the entrance. Damien stood behind the serving counter wearing a simple apron instead of an expensive tailored coat, carefully filling meal containers alongside dozens of volunteers. When Elliot stepped forward holding an empty food tray, Damien looked up with the same calm expression he had worn months earlier, but this time there was no uncertainty in his eyes. Without ceremony or hesitation, he placed a generous meal into the tray before saying words both of them had waited almost 2 decades to hear. "Welcome home, son." Elliot smiled through grateful tears that no longer came from loneliness but from finally belonging somewhere without conditions, secrets, or fear. Around them, no one applauded because there was nothing extraordinary about a father serving his child lunch. That simple moment mattered precisely because it had become ordinary. As the sun settled over Harbor East, golden light reflected across the water where fishing boats drifted peacefully toward the horizon. The same docks where an undocumented Omega had once quietly asked for leftovers had become a place where forgotten people found dignity instead of rejection. In a world built upon Alpha, Beta, and Omega identities, laws would always matter, bloodlines would always carry meaning, and history would always leave its marks. Yet Elliot's story proved that the strongest foundation any society could build was not power, privilege, or status. It was the courage to recognize every person as worthy of being seen, remembered, and welcomed home. What would you have done if you were in this situation? Tell us in the comments. If you love Alpha and Omega stories filled with passion, loyalty, heartbreak, and second chances, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.